Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us here this afternoon for this press conference to present the preliminary findings and conclusions, sort of preliminary statement of findings and conclusions from the limited collection observation mission sent by the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights to observe the presidential election in Uzbekistan. In case you need a translation and haven't picked this up yet, there is simultaneous translation, but the press conference and headsets can be picked up at the back by where you enter the room. Let me introduce the panel, if you like. Joining us today and presenting the report will be Tana Dzuleta, the head of the mission. With us as well, Pascal Roussi, the deputy head of mission, and my name is Thomas Reimer, I'm the spokesperson. There will be, after Tana's presentation, time for questions from the media, but before that, with no further ado.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. For those who attended our opening press conference, welcome back. And I hope that your curiosity will be satisfied with our findings. As mentioned to you before, the OSCE ODL received an invitation from the authorities of Uzbekistan to observe the presidential election, which took place yesterday, 29th of March. And it is on our conclusions, our preliminary findings and conclusions following our observation, that I wish to inform you. But before I do so, I'd like to extend special thanks to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Central Election Commission for extending the invitation to our mission to observe these elections. I would like to thank all of our interlocutors in the institutions and the political parties, members of international organizations and delegations, for finding the time to talk to us and for sharing their own views with us. I would like to say we were here at a time of an important public holiday, and on this occasion and on all others, our mission members, both in Tashkent and in the regions, were made to feel very welcome. And we are very appreciative of this gift of hospitality which we received. If you remember, we opened our mission on 23rd of February. We were joined by 10 long-term observers who were deployed in 5 teams of 2 across the regions. So it is on the findings of the core team, 11 people here based in Tashkent, and 10 long-term observers, that we have drawn our conclusions. This is what we call a limited election observation mission. We were not joined by short-term observers, and there were no observers from the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Our mandate, if you will recall, was to assess the election for its compliance with OSCE commitments, other international obligations, and standards for democratic elections, as well as with national legislation. Yesterday's presidential election took place in what remains a strictly controlled political and media environment, leaving no room for genuine opposition, and dominated by the figure of the incumbent. In this environment, the mission observed that a number of legal and organizational shortcomings of the electoral process remain unaddressed. In particular, provisions in the legal framework for elections continue to contravene OSCE commitments and other international obligations and standards for democratic elections, while the fundamental freedoms of association and expression are effectively curtailed. The campaign was characterized by the absence of any real competition of ideas and political views. As indicated to us by our institutional interlocutors and confirmed by the Central Election Commission, the Constitution remains the most important law for the conduct of the presidential election. Nonetheless, despite a clear constitutional limit of 2 consecutive presidential terms, the CEC registered the incumbent candidate. This was, to our understanding, in contravention of the rule of law and raises doubts about the Commission's independence. We noted positively that some previous OSCE ODM recommendations were indeed addressed in regulations. In particular, posting of results protocols in polling stations is now prescribed by a new regulation. However, the regulation was adopted just 2 weeks before the election, after formal training of polling staff was completed. None of the members of our mission present in polling stations last night at the time of the count observed this regulation put into practice. Maybe other observers did. It is to be hoped that in time this practice will be consolidated, because experience in other countries has shown that it does improve trust and transparency in the process. Another new regulation permits the establishment of PECs, precinct election commissions, in places for pre-trial detention. The possibility of people under pre-trial detention to be able to vote is one of the long-standing OSCE recommendations, and we did visit some places of pre-trial detention to see how this possibility was effectively guaranteed. Unfortunately, in terms of legal framework, we regret to note that the abolition of the possibility of running for president as an independent candidate, which was adopted by law in 2008 after the previous presidential election, was a step backwards. The election administration and polling day. We were glad to note that the CEC met all legal deadlines and performed its work in a professional and generally transparent manner, though it did not make all its decisions public. Voter lists is a question that you will recall we have in the past and once again attempted to look carefully at the formation of voter lists. In the absence of a central voter register, this is an important question in the election administration and its organisation. We noted that these lists were organised in a variety of ways throughout the country, and the inconsistency in the method of compilation puts the accuracy of voter lists in doubt. In the absence of a unified voter register, no cross-checks for multiple entries or for the inclusion, for example, of those residing abroad are possible. We visited, as I said, a limited number of polling stations, but we were present throughout the country, and on our visits we were able to confirm that this was indeed a well-resourced, carefully, indeed minutely prepared election. The infrastructure was good, and the spaces available generally ample, even to the extent we were able to observe in rural areas. Staff had been recruited and were on call in ample time, with plenty of time to complete comprehensive training. The conduct of voting was orderly and calm. However, during in most polling stations visited by the OSCE observers. Proxy voting in particular, on behalf of several voters at once, appeared to be almost universally practiced. And election commissions at the end of the day often face difficulties filling out results protocols. On the question of the media, which, as you know, we follow carefully, and as I explained to you, we established media monitoring of 4 national networks and print media, beginning on 25th of February. This monitoring showed that the state-owned media granted candidates ample free of charge airtime and print space, as foreseen by the law. But both state-owned and private media dedicated a large portion of coverage of the incumbent's institutional activities, giving him a clear advantage. I think it's worth noting that past OSCE recommendations regarding the media remain almost entirely unaddressed. These recommendations were intended to increase freedom of the media. In particular, the question of decriminalizing defamation, guaranteeing freedom of speech, less restrictive conditions for registration as media operators, and other questions. Other OSCE recommendations which remain unaddressed concern fundamental freedoms, the possibility of registering as a candidate. You will note in our reports that we consider these still too restrictive. The possibility to register as NGOs. Clarification is needed here. There is too much space for discretionary decisions that penalize the possibility of forming independent civil society organizations. These are the main OSCE recommendations which remain unaddressed. But a number of these also concern legal framework, as I mentioned to you earlier. But on all these points, and what I said to you before, we'd be delighted to take your questions.
Thank you, Tana. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's an opportunity now for questions from the media. I would ask you please just to raise your hand, and we will have a microphone brought to you. Could you also, before presenting your question, if you could please just identify, give us your name, as well as the media outlet which you're representing.
Вчера уже в 10 часов вечера было объявлено в группе голосование, и то, что было отмечено, что больше 90% избирателей проголосовали. И вот что вы видите, наблюдали ли вы активность избирателей на избирательных участках? Это первый вопрос. И второй вопрос я бы хотела задать с точки зрения у нас в стране, как вы знаете, проживают разные национальности. Есть компактное проживание некоторых национальностей. И как с этой точки зрения были соблюдены их права?
On the question of turnout, the figure of 90 is indeed high. Unfortunately, in the absence of systematic election observation, as we would do with a full election observation mission, which would enable us to do statistical analysis, we could attempt a parallel assessment. In this case, we are not in a position to do so. Possibly, by the time we draft our final report, we may have noted inconsistencies in reconciliation figures of turnout at different levels, but we we are not in a position to say that. We did note that there was great tolerance for proxy voting, and that is a way of ensuring high turnout. On the question of the nationalities, this is something that, if you will see in our report, we intend to look at. We obtained slightly more up-to-date figures on the main nationalities present in the country. But during our presence in this country, we did not receive any information that any representatives of these groups felt unduly discriminated at any phase in the process. The guarantees in terms of language on the ballot papers, I'm not at this point in time able to answer you whether everyone received ballot papers in language, their own language, but the presence of the two languages by all our interlocutors in all election materials and some more in Karakalpak was considered sufficient by those people who we managed to speak. It was not an issue that was brought to our attention. It's also pointed out to us that members of all the nationalities are present in the different political parties in Parliament.
Как вы можете оценить работу Центральной избирательной комиссии с точки зрения открытости и гласности? Имели ли возможность члены вашей миссии посещать беспрепятственно заседания Центральной избирательной комиссии? И если имели, посещали ли они? Извиняюсь, Чугарина, газета Узбекистан.
Thank you. Yes, as I mentioned in those brief comments I made, the Central Election Commission operated transparently, opening its meetings to ourselves as international observers and others, and the media. 3 meetings were held during our observation period, and we were able to attend all 3. Our only comment on the question of transparency was that some decisions were not made public, or others were made public after a considerable delay. But we were able to attend, and others were too. Thank you.
Лапоматидов, глава Минсуса. Что, на ваш взгляд, выгодно отличает работу Государственной комиссии в Узбекистане от аналогов комиссии в Uzbekistan? И можно ли что-то позаимствовать из нашего национального языка? Спасибо.
It is true that the OSCE has observed 300 elections, but we don't compare elections, and we don't hold one institution up against another. Our mandate is to judge the country on its own merits, that is, its conformity with the laws to which that country has subscribed and the standards to which it is party. So, best practices would have to be identified by the practitioners and exchanged by them amongst themselves. And if our reports can be helpful in that respect, maybe some comparative reading, and then you see, maybe they could invite each other.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Джамиля, Национальная ассоциация электронных СМИ. Вот вы, госпожа Кайтан, сказали в своем докладе, что негосударственные СМИ преобладало в, скажем, действующего президента. Поэтому мы хотели бы узнать, вот я как представитель негосударственных СМИ, узнать, на каких основах вообще строится мониторинг и примеры, какие возможности телестанции и радиостанции именно превышания.
We wouldn't point fingers, but we look up statistical averages, and we have compared these averages and the percentage of time dedicated by both private and state media in its outside of the free airtime, that is the news coverage, granted very much higher time. I have the figures here. From 25 February to 29 March, we monitored, as you know, 30 media outlets. These were television stations, Uzbekistan, Yoshlar, Toshkent, Uzreport TV. And the radio was Uzbekistan. The newspapers were Narodne Slovo, Pravda Vostoka, Zar Sochi, Adolat, Militik Malish, Uzbekistan Ovozi, Darhachi, and 21 Astra, if I am reading it correctly. So, if you look at Uzreport, we have 54% of current affairs and news airline coverage of the incumbent in its institutional capacity. Toshkent, 49%, Uzbekistan, 29%, and Yoshlar, 23%. All of this coverage is positive or neutral. I mean, on some occasions, the others, candidates, though present, were simply ignored. One example might be the Navos celebrations. They were all present, but they did not receive even 1 inch of television attention, but they were present. So that is why our conclusions were that this was to the advantage of the incumbent in current affairs and news coverage. But the figures are all there in the report and will be even more detailed with tables in our final report. They're in the footnotes now, then they will take the shape of tables.
Yes, I think we have, sorry, just to interrupt, I think we have time for 2 more questions this afternoon, so yourself and then.
Добрый день, Сатор Гаджи, информационное агентство УЗА. У меня вот такой вопрос. Сегодня с утра, как вы знаете, в Республиканском президенте прошли 3 пресс-конференции, мы уже успели пройти 3 пресс-конференции. Это Всемирная ассоциация избирательных органов, исполкома СНГ и ШОС. И в этих пресс-конференциях, а также в интервью с массовой информации, представители международных миссий отметили высокий уровень организации выборов, также они отметили высокую явку избирателей, активность политических партий. И они уже отметили, что они признают прошедшие выборы президента состоявшимися. Разделяете вы это мнение?
Could you clarify the term completed?
Последняя часть вопроса, пожалуйста, просто не помню. Вы не помните.
Из международных наблюдателей отметили, что выборы в Узбекистане признали выборы Узбекистане состоявшимся. Разделяете ли вы?
As mentioned before, it cannot be in our mandate to recognize the validity of an election, and it is for the legal bodies of the country concerned. It is in our mandate to assess an election for its compliance with standards which I mentioned to you before. We follow a methodology, a very well-tried methodology, and which includes analysis of the legislation and of the political environment and media environment, as well as conducting a campaign and polling day itself. And the conclusions which I attempted to summarize to you before, I agree, they don't sound the same. And we discussed this yesterday with our friends and colleagues from the CIS. I say colleagues because I'm a former member of Parliament in Syria. And we agreed that on the basis of our differing methodologies, we might well make different conclusions. But we have always had a good relation in spite of this. And we refer to CIS standards in our own documents. So we hope that this proceeding in parallel will not lead to any confusion or misunderstanding, and that we can achieve something, even though we are reaching our conclusions in a different way.
Yes, I think our final question today.
Газета «Узбекистан Today». Госпожа Лиза, я все-таки не согласен с вами и с комиссией, что якобы какая-то кандидатура преобладала. Вы, в частности, вот отвечая уже на вопрос моей коллеги, назвали некоторые печатные издания. Я не знаю, как вы изучали, например, «Народное слово», да? Вы можете линейку взять и, значит, посмотреть по линейке, сколько тем или иным кандидатам, и убедитесь, что никакого преобладания не было. Теперь, вы в качестве примера привели Навруз. Дело в том, что один из кандидатов – действующий глава государства. И по существующему закону нет такого закона, чтобы он, предположим, уходил в отпуск там во время выборов или там еще чего-то подобного. Кстати, такая же практика существует и во многих других государствах. И естественно, мой вопрос, все-таки, может быть, вы пересмотрите свою позицию в отношении печатных изданий. Мне кажется, у вас там несоответствие. Спасибо.
I stand by the conclusions of our monitoring team, which consisted of 7 people. I think you have to read carefully what we wrote, and I hope I did not summarize it incorrect, but what we wrote is there, and it's based on this observation. We have not confused the generous provision of space provided in the print media for free of charge to the candidates with coverage of current affairs, which are 2 different categories, and the percentages I referred to you were coverage of current affairs. Now, the generous provision of space is something which is provided for in the law and was absolutely respected by the state-owned media. Then it's up to the candidates to use that well and effectively, and that is not for us to judge.
All right, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for this presentation of the preliminary findings and results from our mission. As I don't believe I did mention, on your way out, both the press release for today and the preliminary statement itself will be available